The jetties at the mouth of the Mississippi River are made of stone hauled from quarries in Wisconsin and Illinois, dropped by hand into water so fast it could sweep a grown man off his feet and carry him into the Gulf before anyone on the next scow over noticed he was gone. The structures stretch more than 17 miles into open water. They were built between 1875 and 1879, and they are still there, still holding the main shipping channel open today. Before steam dredges existed in any practical form, before reinforced concrete, before diesel cranes or pneumatic pile drivers, 20,000 laborers drove those stones into the river bottom using wooden scows, iron positioning spuds, and hand tools that had not changed in any meaningful way since the Roman era. The Army Corps of Engineers approved the project. A civilian engineer named James Buchanan Eads designed it and financed much of it himself. The men who actually built it had no union, no safety equipment, no medical coverage, and no guarantee of a grave with their name on it if the river took them. Most of those men are not recorded anywhere except as a line in a tally book. What they left behind is one of the most consequential pieces of civil engineering in American history, and almost no one alive today could tell you how it was put together. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Mississippi River Delta had been choking American commerce for 2 decades before the jetty project began. The problem was sediment. The river, by the time it reached the Gulf of Mexico, was moving slowly enough that it deposited whatever it was carrying, and what it carried was enormous. Sand, silt, clay, and organic debris settled at the river's mouth in constantly shifting bars that could change depth by 3 feet overnight, depending on wind direction and river stage. Ships drawing more than 9 or 10 feet of water ran aground trying to enter or leave, and the largest commercial vessels of the 1870s drew 18 feet or more fully loaded. New Orleans was the second busiest port in the country. Ships queued in the Gulf for days, sometimes for weeks, paying daily demurrage charges while their pilots argued over which channel might be passable that particular morning. The economic damage was counted in the tens of millions of dollars every year. The Corps of Engineers had tried dredging. They had cut new channels through the bar. Every solution was temporary because the river kept depositing faster than any machine of that era could remove it. Eads proposed something different. His argument was that the river itself could be made to scour its own channel if that channel were narrowed enough. Build parallel stone walls from the riverbank out to deep water, compress the flow between them, and the current would accelerate through the gap. Water moving fast enough carries sediment rather than dropping it. The channel would self-maintain. The physics were sound and had precedent in European river engineering. What no one had worked out completely was how to build stone walls in a river mouth where the only foundation was soft delta mud, where the current regularly ran at 4 knots and hit 6 during flood season, and where the nearest quarried stone was more than 1,000 miles away by water. The men hired for this work came from every failing economy in the post-war South and from the immigrant labor markets of New Orleans, Mobile, and Galveston. Many were freedmen working their first regular wage jobs since emancipation. Others were Irish and German laborers who had followed railroad construction south and found themselves without contracts when the rail lines reached their current terminus. There were Cajun men from the bayou parishes who knew the delta water but had never seen construction at this scale. There were itinerant workers who had drifted down from the levee camps further north, following whatever work was open. They were paid between $1 and $1.50 per day depending on the task assigned, and they worked 6 days a week in subtropical heat on open water with no shade structure of any kind. They slept on camp boats tied to the levee bank, ate from a common cook boat that moved with the construction front, and were expected to show up at the work scows at first light, regardless of what the river was doing. Foremen kept tally books by first name or by number. The records that survived are held in the National Archives. Reading them, you encounter men listed only as Jim, or as number 47, or as the German, with no further identification. The construction method Eads specified was called mattress and stone, adapted from Dutch river engineering practice that dated back several centuries. The first stage was the mattress, a woven mat of willow branches cut from the river's own banks, bundled and lashed together into flat sections, roughly 30 feet wide and as long as the supply scow that carried them. Willow was chosen because it bends without breaking under load, resists decay in saturated conditions longer than most woods, and could be harvested and worked by completely unskilled hands, using nothing more than a hatchet and a coil of binding wire. Teams of laborers worked in the backwater channels behind the levees, cutting branches and weaving them flat, stacking layers perpendicular to each other, the way a basket is made, binding them with wire at every crossing point. A completed mattress section, before any stone was loaded onto it, weighed several tons. Those sections were floated out on the timber scows to the marked construction line, positioned by surveyors calling course adjustments across open water using flag signals, and then deliberately sunk by loading quarry stone onto their surfaces until they settled to the river bottom. The stone itself came down by barge from limestone quarries at Grafton in Illinois and from granite operations further north near the Great Lakes, offloaded at New Orleans into smaller flat-bottomed vessels and pushed south in tows. The final unloading onto the mattress sections was done entirely by hand. Men stood at the scow's gunwales and passed stone piece by piece, dropping each one onto the mat below with enough care to distribute the weight evenly across the surface. Deck marks on the scow told the foreman when the load count was sufficient to hold the mat flat against the current. If a mat shifted during the sinking process, it would wrinkle and leave voids, and the stone placed above it would not seat evenly. An uneven foundation meant the wall above would settle unevenly over time, crack along the weak points, and eventually fail. The men dropping that stone had no instrument to tell them whether the mat below was lying flat. They watched the water surface, watched how the scow moved, and listened to what the foreman called from the stern. Once a mattress section was settled and loaded with its initial stone course, the wall itself began to rise above the waterline. Stone was placed in courses, each layer overlapping the joints of the layer below, the same principle used in dry stone walling for thousands of years. There was no mortar, the wall held by weight and by the interlocking geometry of the stone faces fitting against each other. Skilled stone setters worked the outer courses, selecting and fitting pieces that had been roughly sorted by size on the supply barges before leaving New Orleans. Unskilled laborers moved the material, passing stone hand to hand up from the barge deck to the working surface. Oversized pieces were broken with sledgehammers directly on the scow before being passed up. The noise on a working section of jetty was constant through the day. Hammers cracking stone, stone grinding on stone as pieces were fitted and adjusted, the shouts of foremen, the low groan of a loaded scow working against its mooring lines in the current beneath the men's feet. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The river did not make any of this easy. The South Pass Jetty, the first of the two parallel arms Eads built, ran directly into the main outflow current of the Mississippi. Flood seasons sent water down the channel at velocities that overpowered the temporary positioning lines strung between anchor poles and shifted partially completed mattress sections laterally before they could be fully stone-loaded and held by their own weight. A mat that moved even a few feet out of alignment had to be abandoned in place, and a new section started beside it, overlapping the displacement. The high water seasons of 1876 and 1877 were particularly damaging. Sections that had taken weeks to position and begin loading were moved overnight, and the survey crews found them in the morning a body length or two south of where they had been the evening before. The foreman had to decide, standing in a flat-bottomed skiff with a sounding line, whether the displacement was small enough to work around or large enough that the structural alignment of the wall would be compromised. When the judgment call went wrong and the wall section above did not seat true, the error would not show itself for months, sometimes not until the stone above it cracked under the weight of the courses above. The wall in those zones where the mats shifted is thicker than the original design specified, because there was no practical method for retrieving what had already been placed. The river simply kept what it moved. Workers fell into the water regularly. The current at the jetty head, where the walls were closest together and the compressed water was fastest, ran at 4 to 5 knots in normal conditions and substantially higher during flood stage. A man who went over the side in that current without a line on him had almost no chance in the water. There were no life rings mounted on the working scows in the early years of the project. Rescue skiffs were not a standard feature of the construction plan. The project records note drownings in the incident tallies, but the actual numbers were almost certainly undercounted because workers who disappeared from the worksite at the end of a shift or went over the side at night when the crews were securing equipment were sometimes simply not listed. Their families, if they had families within reach, received no formal notification. The tally book closed and the new day's roster opened. Malaria was a fixture of every construction season. The Mississippi Delta in summer was one of the most disease-ridden environments in North America at that period. The connection between mosquitoes and the disease was not yet medically established. The working theory among engineers and foremen was that the illness came from bad air rising off the marsh grass and standing water, which is where the word malaria itself comes from. Workers who developed the shaking fever were moved off the active construction barges to the camp boats moored further upstream, where they either recovered on their own over a week or two or did not. Those who died in the camp boats were buried along the levee bank in unmarked ground. There are no grave markers. The pace of construction across those 4 years was uneven, and the reasons were as much financial as they were physical. Eads had negotiated an unusual contract with the federal government. He would receive payment only when the channel reached measured depths at specified intervals. 14 feet of depth paid one installment, 20 feet paid another. The full sum came only when the channel reached 28 feet at low water, sustained over a survey period long enough to confirm the scouring action was permanent, rather than a seasonal fluctuation. This arrangement put the financing risk squarely on Eads rather than on the government, and it meant the construction moved at the pace of his available capital and the patience of his private investors. When the channel surveys came back short of the target depth, the payments stopped. When the payments stopped, the workforce shrank. There were periods during 1876 and 1877 when the active crew dropped to a fraction of its full strength. Workers who had been on the project for months were told without ceremony that there was no work that week, or the week after. They slept on the camp boats, walked back toward New Orleans to look for day labor on the docks, or waited on the levee bank for the word that the tally books were open again. Some of them never came back. Others were there every time the hiring started over. What made the system eventually function as Eads had predicted was the physics of compressed flow that he had calculated from the beginning. By 1879, the South Pass Channel had scoured itself to a sustained depth of 30 feet at low water. The narrowed passage between the completed walls was moving water fast enough to carry the river's sediment load out into open gulf rather than allowing it to settle at the bar. Ships that had been forced to lighten their cargo in the Gulf roadstead before attempting the bar were entering the river at full draft. The port of New Orleans reopened at full commercial capacity for the first time in years. Eads received the final contract payment. The workforce was discharged, and most of the men who had built the structure walked away without any record that they had been there. The 2 jetty walls built at South Pass total roughly 9 miles of structure in the water. The longer pair at Southwest Pass, completed in the decade that followed under different engineers using the same mattress and stone method, adds 8 more miles. The stone placed in those walls was moved from quarries in Illinois and the Great Lakes to the floor of the Gulf of Mexico without a single piece of powered mechanical handling equipment on any of the construction scows. Every stone was touched by at least 4 pairs of human hands between the quarry face and its final position in the wall. The willow mattresses below the stone layers are still in place, compressed now under a century and a half of load, still holding the foundation flat in the mud. Diesel crane barges replaced the hand-loading scow method by the 1920s. Pneumatic tools replaced the hand hammers. By the time the Army Corps was doing major repair work on the original jetty sections in the mid-20th century, the construction method Eads and his foreman had developed on site had been entirely abandoned. No one was left who had worked the mattress method in practice. The knowledge Eads filed in his reports to the Corps described the technique in general terms, but those reports did not capture the accumulated field adjustments the foreman had made over 4 years. The specific wire tension that held a mattress flat in a 4-knot current, the stone size that a standing man could drop accurately onto a submerged mat without displacing it, the way you read the water surface to know whether the mat below had shifted. That knowledge went with the men who carried it, and those men are in unmarked ground along the levee bank. The channel at South Pass is still open. Ships still use it. The jetty walls are still holding it, patched in sections, reinforced where the stone face has slumped over the decades, but founded on the same willow and stone that 20,000 men who earned $1 a day laid by hand into the mud of the Mississippi Delta, in the summer heat, in malaria season, in the dark at the end of a 12-hour shift, with no equipment designed to save them if the river decided to take them, and no record of their names on anything that has survived. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.